the first thing I would say that is Scotland is very ambitious for food. I think in terms of the government, it would be in their top 3 or 5 policies maybe, which is quite unusual. And it has ambitions to double the food and drink sector, which is our fastest growing sector. So just a quick overview of Scotland for those that don't know. Population quite small, about 5.5 million. There are 32 local authorities, 2,500 schools, 700,000 pupils. About 67% of these schools have their own kitchens. All staff are employed and trained by the local authority. There are no contract catering companies providing school or hospital meals, so there are no companies such as Sodexo or Compass. It's all done by local authorities. There are statutory legal food and nutrition standards, and compliance of these standards is monitored by qualified health and nutrition inspectors that go into schools. Pupils pay an average about €2.50 for a 2-course meal. The economic cost is about €3.50, so every meal is subsidised. And everything that happens in the public sector is kind of governed by sustainable procurement. So we're looking for a social, economic and environmental win in terms of catering and food procurement. Now, Scotland should be ambitious for food. It has a wonderful larder. We produce some of the best salmon. Most of the white fish that's used in Europe is landed in Scotland. We have fantastic lamb, Aberdeen Angus beef, shellfish, berries, oats, rape oilseed or rapeseed, and of course whiskey. So we have a fantastic larder. The paradox is that we struggle with world-beating levels of diet-related disease, and in the population there are very poor expectations in relation to food and diet. Now I'll touch on health statistics later on in the presentation. So this talks about the evolution that we've had in Scotland around about food and drink policy. We have a national food and drink policy that everyone lines up behind. Within that, I'll talk about the context of school food, and then I'll touch on, is Scotland making progress? Because the first policy was 2007-08, so we've been at this for a while. Now that first policy was called Recipe for Success. Now you'll find examples of policies around the world, but they tend to be quite what I call niche or quite specific. They might be about organic, or they might be about tourism, or they might be, I don't know, about growing jobs. Scotland's policy was quite broad. It was about health, education, the economy, including tourism and growing the food and drink sector. It was about food access and affordability. It was about food security, and it was about public food, so the food served in schools and hospitals and so on. And it was a hugely successful policy. You can see some of the numbers there. 50% growth in exports, a 24% increase in turnover, a 35% increase in the number of Scottish brands sold across the UK and England and Wales and so on, an explosion in local food movements, a lot of investment in food education, and there's been some progress in relation to diet. So a very successful policy, but it had the reputation in Scotland of being an industry policy. And so for that reason, we accepted the success that was there, but we tried to re-energize the policy with a second iteration of the National Food and Drink Policy called Becoming a Good Food Nation, which looked more about the quality of food we're eating, and it had the kind of mission, a good food nation, not only in what we as a nation produce, but also in what we buy, serve and eat. For Becoming a Good Food Nation, we launched a public consultation, and there was I think some 4,000 responses to that consultation. And it was looking like things, but yes, a focus on sustainable economic growth, but also about organic food and about food education and behaviour change. So it was zeroing in more on the quality issues, okay. Okay, so in the programme for government, I see that the Scottish Government are talking about legislating for the Good Food Nation Bill so that it becomes less about guidance and aspiration, and they're going to enshrine some of the responses from the consultation into legislation, into a Good Food Nation Bill. And I think that might see an impact on local authorities. My experience is that in local authorities, food is something that just kind of happens. It's not a high priority. So placing a duty on local authorities perhaps to produce a local policy on food, to explain how they're procuring food, how they're supporting local food business and so on, I think will be a good thing. It has to... The food policy obviously is not standing in isolation. We're looking for policy coherence, so you've got things like recent legislation, climate change, sustainable procurement reform act, community empowerment, land reform, obesity strategy, circular economy and so on. So lots of legislation that's linked in a coherent way to the National Food and Drink Policy, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals are very much part of that as well. So I'd like to offer you that statement that school food should be the exemplar of a good food nation, and that if we can't get it right, if we can't get food right for children, then really we have to take a hard look at ourselves. In Scotland, don't expect you to look at that diagram. What I'm saying is that school food delivers for a whole range of other policies and desirable actions round about the environment, the economy, education and health. So we see school food as the exemplar that's the heart of building a good food nation. The journey began in 2002, 2003. Now, remember I said Scotland's a nation of 5.5 million people. It invested £137 million between the years 2003 and 2009 to improve school food. So it looked at every aspect of school food, not only the food that was on the plate, but the dining room, how that linked in with school education, establishing legal statutory nutrient standards for school meals, how to influence choice in a positive way. So that was a big investment, and that's not just been a one-off investment. The Scottish Government have maintained that. They put a further 35 million in to provide universal free school meals for every child aged 5 to 8. It puts about 700,000 a year into supporting food education. And it's expanding early years, kindergartens and so on, and the food that's provided there. In order to achieve that reform in school food, we had to look at procurement reforms. So there's the Procurement Reform Act, which is fundamentally about anything that's bought in Scotland has to be bought sustainably. Guidance under the Procurement Reform Act uniquely mentions food as one of the key issues. We produced other guidance both for suppliers who were keen to supply to into schools, a guide called Unlocking Opportunities in Public Procurement Contracts. So, and for all suppliers, there's a free online portal where they just register, and any contract for food or anything else for that matter, but any contract for food that's coming up for a hospital or schools or a local authority, they can find out about and tender for it if they wish. There's going to be other developments around about the statutory food and nutrition standards will set maximum limits for the consumption of red and processed meat, to reduce the amount of red and processed meat, increase the amount of fruit and vegetables, reduce sugar, and encourage the use of local produce and so on, and restrict the promotion and marketing of foods that are high in fat, salt and sugar. At every stage in a child's time at school, they will learn something about food. That's mandated in the school curriculum. So at age 5, I don't know, they might learn about, I don't know, social manners sitting in the school. By the time they're 16 or 17, they'll be learning about making sensible food choices and so on. And in between that, they'll learn about, I don't know, how to make a pot of soup and so on. So food is significant within the Scottish curriculum. But we also produced guidance for caterers and teachers to try and bridge between the school dining room and the kitchen and what happens in the whole school. So that gave guidance to caterers around about school food provision, sustainability, communication with parents, all the aspects that you would expect a good school catering service would deliver. Is Scotland making progress? Well, it set the world's most ambitious climate change targets, which commits the country achieving net zero emissions by 2045. And within that, food is recognised as a key issue. In terms of overweight and obesity, which we have an issue with. Sometimes I think we're just good at collecting the figures, but I think we rival the US, for example, in terms of overweight and obesity. There is some progress, as you'll see, from children 2 to 15, but in terms of the adult population, there's very little has actually changed. Scotland's industry we see as part of the solution, and the industry organisation, Scotland Food and Drink, has adopted being responsible. So that's being responsible round about health and what's produced and the environment and sustainability and so on. So we don't see the industry as an us and them. You're producing bad food and that's compounding the problem. We see industry as part of the solution, and we're grateful that industry has signed up to that being responsible aspect. The amount of food, local food, Scottish food that's going into schools in 2007-8 was 34%. By 2013 was 48%. It's now probably over 53%. So we can see real progress there. Just finishing off last 3 slides, and it's just about a project, because I am a caterer, I am a local government officer, and I decided to change the school food system in 2003 in East Ayrshire. And I brought in local suppliers and explained, we all sat around the table and I explained what I was trying to achieve, and we completely redesigned the menus, and we achieved sort of at least 30% organic, at least 50% was locally produced, and almost all of it was bought in fresh, cooked fresh, served fresh. So that means nothing to you, I totally realise, but I'm just saying that I localised the supply chain to within 30 miles of my office, which was in Kilmarnock in Scotland, and that massively reduced food miles, as well as creating employment and other opportunities for local suppliers. An independent consultant came along and was interested and wanted to see what that meant, localising the food chain, what that meant in terms of CO2 reductions. And it was 38 tonnes of CO2 for one school for 1 year. Another organisation came and tried to evaluate what we were doing in East Ayrshire in terms of better menus, localised food chain, and so on. And they reckoned that it was £1 spent in that way was returning 3 to the region, but it could be as high as 6. And I think it's perhaps worth discussing at some later point that I really think that we need some sort of metrics like that we can push sustainability, but we need to understand a recognised methodology of what impact that's having. And last slide, but just to say, in terms of municipalities and local authorities, why would you want a more sustainable food service? Well, maybe it is a vote winner. That was a survey that we carried out, and 95% of parents approved because it keeps money in the community. 80% of people thought it was better for the environment, and 77% thought it was a good use of public money. Thank you.